Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, when I think of turning points of the Civil War, of which there are many, my mind lights up with Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the twin victories on July 3rd and 4th, 1863, sealed the fate of the Confederacy. Among those other turning points, I want to talk about one of them in this video. It's pictured here in this Kurtz and Allison engraving from the Library of Congress. It's the triumph of U.S. forces at Fort Donelson in early February of 1862. It turned the tide of the Civil War. Then, still in its early days, only the 10th month. Up until this early time, the population who remained loyal to the U.S. Constitution had really had nothing but a string of bad news: the bombardment of Fort Sumter, the shocking loss at Manassas, the embarrassment at Ball's Bluff, the army being pushed into the Potomac River. Well, there was little good news to celebrate. Meanwhile, the opposite was true on the Confederate side. Confederate States of America celebrated victories by Joseph E. Johnston, Pierre G.T. Beauregard, Stonewall Jackson. The future of the Confederate nation burned bright during those early months of the war. Everything changed. In early 1862, on February 6th, a little-known general named Ulysses S. Grant, with a naval force commanded by Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote, compelled the surrender of the garrison of Fort Henry along the Tennessee River, and then Grant marched his troops a dozen miles overland to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. A week after the capitulation of Fort Henry, a 3-day operation against Fort Donelson ended with a second loss to Southern arms in a week. The surrender of 13,000 prisoners, rumors of cowardly generalship, loss of control of major waterways, and the subsequent fall of the Tennessee capital of Nashville cast a pall over the Confederate States. Meanwhile, in the United States, the military lost no time in exploiting strategic advantages along the Western Front as the country celebrated a newly minted hero who offered one option: unconditional surrender to his foes. That, of course, is U.S. Grant. Newspapers across the Union hailed victory as breaking the back of the secession serpent. The Southern press, meanwhile, noted the shameful surrender precipitated by the unmitigated disaster that had befallen the Confederacy. I want to share two newspaper editorials, one Northern and another Southern, to give you a sense of the public reaction to the events. Let's begin with the Southern perspective. Here's a view from the Richmond Times-Dispatch of February 24th, 1862. You'll hear mentions of two Confederate generals, John B. Floyd and Gideon J. Pillow, both of whom escaped prior to the surrender, leaving the army in the hands of General Simon Bolivar Buckner. The title of this editorial is simple: The War. And here's how it goes. We record today the saddest disaster of the war, the capture of 12,000 prisoners at Fort Donelson, and the surrender of Nashville. Both events are deeply to be deplored. We do not understand how 12,000 men with arms in their hands could have ever endured the shame of surrender. One report says they wept with rage at the humiliating decision of their commanders. It is equally inexplicable how 800 under Floyd and Pillow could have made good their escape while 12,000 laid down their arms. The fall of Nashville, where there were no defenses, was the inevitable sequence of the fall of Donelson, but we have no particulars of the event. This sort of war is unworthy of the Southern Confederacy. We must change it in toto, and that at once, or prepare ourselves for the most abject and degrading servitude recorded in history. These reverses, though great and calculated to entail vast misery on our people are not vital. By proper vigor in the administration, they will be repaired. We must burn cotton and tobacco before the advancing enemy, and, above all, we must meet invasion by invasion. Let them, if they will, desolate the valley of the Mississippi and all our southern towns and cities, but let us gather our whole strength and precipitate ourselves in resistless force upon Pennsylvania. So there's the Southern perspective. They're talking invasion in this early part of 1862. Of course, this is going to come true in the Antietam campaign later that year, and then again, the Gettysburg campaign in 1863. So now let's go to the other side. Let's look at the Union. And in this perspective, we're going to look at the February 18th, 1862 edition of the Chicago Tribune, only 2 days after the surrender at Donelson. You're going to hear mention of Confederate General Felix Zollicoffer, President Jefferson Davis, Tennessee Governor and future President Andrew Johnson, Union Generals Don Carlos Buell, Ambrose E. Burnside, and Union Navy Commodore Andrew Hull Foote. Now, this editorial is looking forward and really sees the end of the Confederacy. And this is happening again in February of 1862. The title of this editorial in the Tribune is Fruits of the Great Victory. And here's how it goes. The storming of Fort Donelson is the turning point in the war. The back of the secession serpent was broken by the blow that captured the rebel fortress. It was the center of their western lines of defense, the key of their position, which in our hands opens wide the door that leads into the heart of rebeldom. The kingdom of Davis will now quickly tumble about his ears like a cob house. It is beyond the strength and resources of the rebels to make a successful stand at any point. The Tennessee River, now open to the Muscle Shoals, will enable our generals to throw a column into northern Alabama, where it is believed that a considerable portion of the people will gladly take shelter under the folds of the dear old flag. The fall of Donelson opens the Cumberland to our gunboats, to the capital of Tennessee, and indeed clear up that river to Mill Springs, the late camp of Zollicoffer's force. It is most likely that any serious resistance will be offered to the advance of our victorious legions either at Clarksville or Nashville. The threat of the rebel leaders that they would burn the latter city on the approach of the Federals will hardly be carried into execution. Such an act of vandalism would not retard the progress of our conquering cohorts and would tend to madden and arouse the Union men of that state to wage a war of extermination against the rebel oppressors and incendiaries. There is nothing but the bad state of the roads to prevent Buell from throwing a strong column into loyal Knoxville within a week and rallying about the Stars and Stripes the loyal and sorely prosecuted mountaineers of the Switzerland of America. It is believed that 10,000 of the non-slaveholding neighbors and friends of Andy Johnson will turn out and help expel the secessionists from East Tennessee. This country, once in our hands, all communication between Richmond and the Southwest is cut off. It is like tapping the jugular vein to seize the great artery of rebel communication. From Knoxville, the road is open and inviting into North Carolina. The western portions of that state contain a population cursed with the presence of but few slaves and, consequently, comparatively loyal in sentiment. A column of Buell's army moving eastwardly would not have far to march to form a junction with Burnside's troops advancing into the interior of the Old North state, thereby isolating the rebel Virginians from the other parts of Secessia and obliging them to submit to the national authority, however reluctantly. The force on the Potomac ought to make short work of the resistance the Virginia rebels could offer. Columbus, if not evacuated, soon will be. The panic-stricken and demoralized garrison cannot be brought up to the scratch. The first glimpse they get of Commodore Foote's gunboats will be their signal for precipitate flight. Once in possession of that position, and the way is clear to Memphis, that city is wholly indefensible against a combined land and water assault, and we do not believe that the rebels will make a stand there. They will surrender it without a struggle. A few days hence, we'll find the national emblem waving over it. Then we get into the cotton region. The flocculent fiber is produced in prolific abundance in the surrounding country. Large shipments of cotton, purchased and confiscated, will shortly be seen pressing northward on the Illinois Central Railroad and eastward up the Ohio, making its way to our cotton factories in New England. Thus, with the capture of Fort Donelson by our brave Western soldiers, Tennessee falls like a ripe pear into the lap of the Union. But the fruits of this important victory are not all gathered when Tennessee is restored to the Union. The Father of Waters stops not in his course at Memphis, but flows with increasing volume to the Gulf. The great national highway can be traversed by the gunboat fleet to New Orleans. New Orleans has yet to fall. That's a few months away. There are no forts on the banks that can impede the descent of Foote's fleet. The big mortars can easily silence any batteries the rebels have planted between Memphis and the Belize. A land force of 50,000 men may be spared from our Western armies to accompany the grand expedition and take possession of the fields plowed by the mortars and clear away any remaining obstructions. From the day the Mississippi was closed by the rebels to this time, the resolution of the people of the West has not wavered or faltered in the purpose to hew their way to the Gulf and restore the free and unimpeded navigation of that great national highway, as well as to punish and crush rebellion along its banks. That high resolve is now on the eve of accomplishment. The Mississippi River once open from its source to the Delta, there will be no more talk of intervention or paper blockades on the part of John Bull or Louis Napoleon. That, of course, the British and French intervention possibility. Then, the editorial continues, on to the Belize, brave Western warriors, and give the serpent of secession its eternal quietus. Our soldiers carried the salvation of the Union on the points of their bayonets at the storming of Donelson. Victory or death was the alternative they set before themselves, and gallantly, gloriously have they redeemed the vow. A nation tenders them its cordial, heartfelt thanks. So that perspective coming from the Union side, from the Chicago Tribune, really lays out the strategic plan. Take the Mississippi, finish severing the communications, and end the war. The editorial suggests that this is a matter of months and is something that can easily be done. But of course, we know with the benefit of hindsight that this is no small task. The Southern armies and the Southern citizenry were not about to end their resistance. That was still more than 3 years to go before the war would come to an end. But thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.